Looking for environmentally friendly ideas for home and garden? We got them right here, and it all starts in 30 seconds. Over the past 20 years as a garden designer, I've enjoyed helping homeowners create private sanctuaries full of beauty and wonder. I find each garden to be a fresh opportunity to explore ways to create uniquely personal spaces. These are just a few of the gardens I've helped to transform into garden homes. Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Welcome to The Garden Home, a show about blurring the lines between inside and out. Now today we're going to be talking about the construction that's going on here. You know, in the building industry there's some bold things happening. It's called green building. Now I don't mean painting buildings green. What I'm talking about are ideas that help us become better stewards of the world around us. Now this is especially important for someone like me who does a lot of gardening. You can bet that I'm doing everything I can to keep the gardens here organic, so why wouldn't I do the same for the house? When I started this building project out here, it kind of struck me funny that people seem to relate to the idea of an organic garden, but when it comes to the materials that make up a house, well, they're okay with cutting a few corners as long as the end result looks good. Now what I'd like to do is put a stop to that line of thinking. The way I see it, we ought to be thinking about our interior spaces the same way we do our gardens. If there's a safer, greener solution, well, we ought to be talking about it. Well, let me give you an example. Bricks, for instance, and that's going to be the cornerstone of this show. It's a great material. It's ancient. It's been around forever, and it comes directly from the earth. Now clearly we've used a lot of brick out here at the Garden Home Retreat. The main building is, well, principally brick. But some of the other buildings have other materials that I think you might find interesting. For instance, these traditional outbuildings are not clad in wood. It does look like clapboard, but this is actually a product made of concrete. So it will last for a long, long time. And these windows, for instance, these are rated with a very high efficiency when it comes to saving energy. Now, if you look at the foundation of the cottage itself, we actually built it with insulated concrete forms. Then there's plywood that sheds water. And inside, we've used soy foam insulation and wallboard that's mold resistant. These are just a few of the green features that are making up the house. But today, I really want to focus on this beautiful red brick. Brian White is a master mason with over 20 years experience. And he came by the Garden Home Retreat a few weeks ago when we were really making progress on laying the brick out here. You know, Brian, a few years ago I was on a job site and saw this brick, this very variety, and was amazed at how old it looked. I mean, it really looked like an antique brick.
Well, that's obviously the way the process works, Alan. It's called a wood mold brick. It's not actually handmade.
Okay.
But it's manufactured in wooden molds.
I see.
It actually has a mold with little indentations in it. A little sand is spread in there so that when you turn the mold over, the brick have to be able to release.
I see. It's sort of like putting flour in a cake pan.
Then the clay is placed, in that mold. As they're then taken out of the mold, they're stacked on kiln cars and pulled through a process for about 36 hours, up to 2,200 degrees sometimes.
2,200.
I mean, what could hurt this brick?
Really? Well, it sure won't be the summer sun. I think what was so intriguing to me, Brian, was the irregularity of the brick. That's what, to me, made it look so old.
Well, that's the effect of the wooden mold. Really, there are no two brick alike on your home.
And the color variation is really quite amazing with this blend alone.
Well, with the reds that you see here, all the way to almost a black, what happens in the process, the kilns that these brick are fired in are called tunnel kilns. As they're pulled through at various places as the heat gets more intense, they're really hit with a burst of energy, and it's called flashing them. So the brick along the sides of the kiln cars or on the top where the fire's coming from,
I see,
gets flashed in much darker than the ones might be in the middle of the car.
They're bearing the most heat.
Exactly.
I see.
So you get this beautiful, warm range of color to go with the brick that each one's a little bit different in its character. But one thing the mason does have to be careful to do is make sure he breaks several bands of brick at a time and gets them blended well, so you don't end up with just one spot of dark ones and a spot of...
I see, yeah.
Got to blend them on side
blotchy.
of it. It sure would.
They typically have 3 holes in the bottom, and these don't have holes in them at all. They just have these 4 indentations.
That's right. This is called a frog. and it's been debated for years where that term came from. But I heard years ago in England, and I like this story, so
You stick with
this
it.
is how it happened.
Okay.
The mules and horses that would be used when they're mining or winning the material to bring the clay into the plant, as they're making their rounds in the clay pit, their feet, the bottom of the horse's hoof is called a frog, would make indentations in that clay that look similar to this.
And they're the horse's prints right there.
Exactly.
Now, there really are a lot of good reasons to use brick. I mean, beyond they just look good.
Yeah. To me, it's what it kind of says about you in a way. It's almost like I've arrived a little bit, you know, because if you look at the real estate ads in the paper, Alan, how often do they say, I got a 3-sides vinyl or whatever product, not to pick on any particular cladding, but brick is just a product that homeowners know will last their lifetime, the lifetime of their kids, and beyond that. And the house appreciates in value too. So
Sure. Well, there's some energy considerations as well.
there are. Brick love the sun, so they soak up solar energy during the day and release it slowly at night. So in the wintertime, it helps to keep the home warm. At the same time, it keeps it cooler just because of its mass.
Yeah.
It's hard for the heat to get through, so the cool air stays inside the home better. So yeah, it's a big savings as far as electricity is concerned, or gas or oil. It's something that the public really likes because of its warmth and its the look. It looks like it's been here for hundreds of years.
Well, I mean, I think they actually refer to these as 17th century.
They are.
Which implies the sort of methodology and I guess the final look that you get.
Yeah.
It's the sort of thing that you would see in historic places like Colonial Williamsburg.
Exactly. The process of making something look older, handmade, is certainly an art.
If you think by choosing brick you're limiting your options in terms of a building material, well, you really need to think again. I just want to point out a few things. Brick are so malleable in terms of what you can build with them, it's really quite astonishing. You can get all sorts of shapes and forms. And here in this garden that I designed several years ago, you see lots of examples of how brick can really put its best foot forward. Take, for instance, these entry piers. The caps themselves you might see in cut stone, but here we chose to use brick. We brought the brick out just a bit. We used brick here that were made in a brick mold with this beautiful sort of cove mold, and then did the capstone, as you can see here at the top. Now, what's great about this is you could also add another dimension in the mortar joint. Now, if we shift from the detail of the individual bricks themselves into what you can create with the bricks, let's take a look at the way we've scalloped in various places on this property from one elevation up to the next. This was a way of tying the brick walls into the landscape from the house itself. So we started high, we scalloped down, we come to an entryway, and then we move on into lower garden walls. This entire property is completely surrounded with brick. You see, the idea was to take an element, the main element of the house, the material used there, and spread it out into the landscape. These low walls create a sense of enclosure for the gardens within, but also allow neighbors to look over the walls and enjoy the beauty. You see, the owners here didn't want this property to feel like a fortress. And you might think, well, that's an awful lot of brick, but when you begin to juxtapose the brick against lots of plantings, such as azaleas, camellias, magnolias, and lots of boxwood, you break up the brick and it doesn't feel so overwhelming. Now, if you'll look over here in the corner, you can see where we're also using vines of various kinds, creating a beautiful marriage, I think, between the living and the structural landscape. Here we're using creeping fig ivy, needlepoint ivy, jasmine, and even climbing roses. You see, the color of this brick is perfect for green foliage. It's the opposite on the color wheel. The complementary color to green is red. And I think the tonal qualities of this brick are particularly nice. Apricot, salmon, and rich orange-colored flowers are ideal against it. And of course, white is a natural. As you can see, brick in all its various forms plays a fundamental role in the structure of this garden. One of the garden home principles of design, for me anyway, is pattern texture and rhythm. And you can find that in a garden you might design, as well as something like laying brick. What we're doing here is we're getting the pattern down for the brick walls of the Garden Home Retreat. And the bond that we're using, the arrangement of the brick, is one called Flemish bond, and that's based on a stretcher, a header, a stretcher, and a header, where you use a brick running horizontally like this, which is the stretcher, and then you use a header, which in this case is a half brick. In the old days it was a whole brick because the walls were much thicker, and they used the header brick to tie the walls together. And then you have the finish of the mortar itself. That's called sacking the wall, just taking a sack, some burlap, and rubbing the mortar off. We want it flush, something very simple. After all, this is just a big old farmhouse. While Master Mason Brian White was at the Garden Home, I couldn't wait to show him how we're using clay pavers to create a pattern in the garden. Hey Brian, come on down here. These guys are really rocking and rolling as they put this floor in.
It looks so nice.
Isn't it coming along?
It's beautiful. I love
really exciting.
The color looks so good.
I think that these clay pavers are going to be perfect against this stone.
I do too, Alan.
You know, there really is an important distinction between a clay paver and a brick, as we call it, for like the house.
Yes, there is, Alan. You could call it a brick, I guess, but it's manufactured in a way that it works well in contact with the earth. Clay pavers, as you'll notice, are uncored.
Or they're solid, in other words.
That's right, they're solid. There are no voids in them at all, unlike the brick on your home. So pavers, clay pavers, and a clay unit that you might use on your house, totally different brick.
Now, you see a lot of concrete pavers out. What's the distinction then between a clay paver and a concrete, and what are the pros and cons?
Well, now this is where I really kind of get on my soapbox a bit with pavers, because a clay paver will hold its color for the next 500 years probably.
So it's color fast.
It is. If you put units like this out there, either with mortar in the joints or, fast against each other and sweep sand in them, either application, you have something that's going to last for generations. If you decide to use a concrete paver, as soon as it's exposed to the sun, it begins to lighten. There's no way to tie up the color in the body of that paver like you can with clay. In an area like we are here with the gentleman working behind us, where you have a concrete underlayment, you'd probably want to use mortar. You wouldn't have to, but in most applications you would, as well as mortar in the joints around the perimeter of the brick. What you want to do is get the water off here so you have some slope away from the house.
Right, and we installed drains here to make sure that we get any water that might blow in from under the porches out.
Very good. But now once you get out in your garden area, your beautiful garden that you have here behind this home, you're going to want the water to be able to percolate down through whatever horizontal brick you have laid on the ground. If you see a floor fail, what it'll be usually is someone has taken a brick that's not a paver, never was meant to be, and used it in their garden, either on its side like a roll-lock so that there's no coring,
right,
or even an uncored brick, an older brick, and in just a few years it begins to fail many times.
So if you're going to use this for flooring, you better make sure you're using a clay paver made for flooring.
Buy a paver.
Made for a horizontal surface.
A clay paver.
And don't try to take a brick that you would have used on the house, because it's going to fail.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good advice. Brian, in thinking about the floor down here, we played around with several different patterns with these clay pavers and finally decided on just the good old basket weave.
It's hard to go wrong there. I put a couple things here for examples. This is called a herringbone. A homeowner probably wouldn't want to try this one himself because there's a lot more cutting. This is a running bond, very similar to the way the brick were laid on your house. It's popular because all you have to do is come back now and put halves.
Yeah.
The only cut you would
Right,
have.
to fill in at the edges.
Right. But with this basket weave, there's really no cutting at all, except maybe around the perimeter.
So this would really be probably the one that would be the least complicated, and there'd be less waste here.
Yes. Now the way the application's taking place here, as we're speaking, the mortar joints that you're placing between them as well as under them isn't, as we mentioned earlier, always the way these brick are laid. Sometimes brick are laid in a garden setting, as you know, for sure. And when that's the case, if there's sand under them and between them, you need something to keep the brick from being too close to each other, so that there's an area for the sand to fall down into.
Right, right.
So these brick are also manufactured in this way for garden settings with what's called lugs. All it is a spacer, and that allows the water to go through, yes, and some area for some sand.
Someone wanted to create a patio across the back of their house, and they wanted to use clay pavers on sand. They really need to find clay pavers that have those lugs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a little more to it than what we've talked about, of course. You may want to hire a mason.
Yeah, well, and that's always handy.
It's not that you couldn't do it yourself, but it depends on what the soil was like. You might need a little base of gravel under it at times, and then there's about an inch setting bed of sand, and it's a little more complicated than it sounds.
Yeah, yeah.
But it certainly turns out a beautiful job in the backyard.
You know, Brian, what I tried to do in choosing this color, this Savannah Brown Antique, was to take the darkest tones in the stone that surrounds this space and then try to reflect that color in the clay paver that we've used here.
Yeah, well, you've done a good job color-wise. And that's a nice thing, again, about brick, having so many choices.
I always enjoy showing you plants that are at their best in my garden, and today I can't help but show you this Salvia leucantha, or Mexican sage. Isn't it spectacular? Now, I grow 3 different varieties out here. One is a purple one that doesn't have the white calyx on it like the other variety has. It's solid purple. The others have a little white drop on it. Both are equally beautiful. And then I also grow one that doesn't get quite as tall. It's called Santa Barbara. It stays under 3 feet. However, mine have gotten a little taller than that. Typically, the Salvia leucantha that I've grown for years gets up to about 4 to 5 feet, so it can be a dramatic statement in the garden. Now, when you plant a garden, what I always try to do is integrate plants that are going to bloom throughout the growing season. So while my salvias don't start flowering really until the end of the season, when they do, they are a cold knockout. But I had to remember to plant them back in the spring. And I used them all the way across the back. So quietly, they were coming up and they were green. And in about 2 weeks ago, they started showing off. And now you can just see what a display they are. The honeybees love them, the bumblebees love them, and best of all, the little hummingbirds, they love salvia. Now, it's a great companion plant for lots of late flowering plants. You can see the asters here in front of me. Well, last week they were gorgeous. This is one called Purple Dome, but it's finished up. But the salvia is moving along strong. It's perfect with some of these old-fashioned roses that are flushing again late in the season. They can be the perfect companion with so many plants in the garden this time of year. The old-fashioned roses, the Caryopteris sunshine blue, as well as lots of my lantana, and of course the ornamental grasses. Now you can also use these blooms in flower displays. They're great for cutting, and I also cut plenty this time of year and dry them by simply hanging bundles of the blooms upside down in the garage or any cool, dark place. Now if you want to grow Mexican sage, here are a few things you need to keep in mind. First, the soil has to be well drained. This plant does not like soggy feet. The other is you need full sun. Most of the salvias love the more sun you can give them. And the next thing is you don't have to fertilize them too much. So don't be too generous with feeding them. Now, one drawback is that these plants can be brittle. So you may want to stake them or cage them so they don't break down in a high wind. Now, there's one other salvia I want to tell you about that can give you this kind of display. It's one called Indigo Spires. I grow it out here at the Garden Home Retreat every year because it is so spectacular. Give them all a try. Brick certainly plays an important role out here at the Garden Home Retreat. We use it in lots of places. Just look at these clay pavers here in the floor in the basement level. You know, they're made the same way that the clay pots that we use in our garden are. In fact, terracotta literally means baked earth. And let me tell you, when it comes to clay pots in the garden, I use every possible shape and size. And I find that this is a good time of year to care for them. For a few, I'm changing the seasonal plantings, and others I'm preparing to store for winter. Since they're fairly expensive, particularly these big guys, it really pays to take care of them. By giving them just a little attention, you can help them last for years. If you clean your containers after using them, you can reduce the chances of passing disease from one planting or season to the next. I like to soak my smaller terracotta pots in a 10% bleach solution for about 30 minutes to kill any pathogens. Or these small containers can be put directly in the dishwasher for sterilization. The discoloration on these pots is caused by salt buildup from fertilizer. I make a paste of baking soda and a little water to make it easier to clean these salt rings. If you live where winter temperatures drop below freezing and you keep your containers outdoors, you'll want to protect them. There are products formulated to help repel the water that gets into the pores of the clay. You see, it's the freezing and expansion of the ice crystals that causes the clay to crack and crumble. With so much going on in the spring, it's nice to have this job done when it's time to fill these containers with flowers again. I enjoy visiting gardens where you can really see the signature of the designer, and that's certainly the case of the garden home of Carol Mendel of Little Rock, Arkansas.
Since my profession is in interior design, it was really natural for me to come out into the yard and to do some design work and create some rooms in the yard. I wanted each room to be an adventure. I wanted it to pull you in and that you would find something new and exciting and maybe something just to tickle your fancy just a little bit. So I've had a lot of fun doing that, and the design background helped me just immensely with that aspect of the garden. What I really loved about this property is it had a barred view, and that is in the back we have the Arkansas River, and you can't ask for a better water feature than that. So I wanted to take different areas of the garden and let you see the river from a different angle. You know, every area that you stage in a garden is just like staging in a house, and you are looking towards a view. So every pause in the garden, there should be a bench. I use pots as exclamation marks. But I also, again, I wanted the yard to be an adventure. I wanted to play in the yard with my grandchildren. I wanted the neighborhood kids to come over. So I wanted to ramble in the yard. Kids today can't really go through neighborhoods like they used to. They can't wander on their own. So I wanted the kids in the neighborhood to feel free to come and wander through the garden and let this be their adventure. And it's worked out great. But I've tried to keep everything very simple, very interesting, very maintenance-free. There's not a stick of grass in this yard. So there's nothing to mow, but there's a ton of weeding. But I actually enjoy the weeding. You know, it's wonderful when you have architectural elements in your garden that are magnificent, but unfortunately we can't all afford the statuary like you see in England. But I think that what we can do, especially here in the South, that we have so many antique malls and flea markets that we can find objects that entertain us, that delight us, bring those into our garden. I found this cricket at a flea market, and I think it gives a little spot in the garden a little bit of personality. And I've got several other elements like that in the garden. I have a group of metal chickens that are feeding together. I think you pick a place in the garden where you would love to have a specimen shrub, but it's too rocky or the soil's not right, and you take that spot and you place your own personality on that by using these found objects. To me, that's what takes a garden it makes it special. It says, this is my garden, it's not your garden. This is my take on it. And that's another way to really express yourself in your garden.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. I hope you've been inspired to think about the home you live in, as well as the interiors, in the same way we do the garden. After all, typically, what's good for the earth is good for us. Until next time, from the Garden Home, I'm Alan Smith. Such a good girl. More information about today's topic and other topics covered in this series can be found at pallansmith.com.
On an upcoming episode of P. Allen Smith's Garden Home.
We're going to take a look back at the progress of the Garden Home Retreat and then look toward the future of environmentally friendly building. The house has transformed from this to this. The gardens have gone from a blank slate to a bountiful harvest. So whether you're building or planting, we've got some great ideas to share with you right here on the Garden Home.